The Galactic Council had existed for 9,000 years, and in all that time, it had never once been afraid of a new species walking through its doors. Until the humans arrived. The orbital station called Valith Prime hung like a silver crown above a dying red star, and inside its ancient halls, 132 spacefaring civilizations gathered to govern the known galaxy. Or at least, that was what they told themselves they were doing. Captain Ilara Marin stepped off the transport shuttle and into the docking ring with 6 members of her delegation behind her, and the first thing she noticed was how quiet everything was. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of something held under pressure. The kind of silence that exists in a room where everyone is afraid to speak too loudly. She was 46 years old, a former United Nations crisis negotiator who had spent 15 years mediating wars, hostage situations, and political collapses. Earth, before the Planetary Council, had chosen her as humanity's first permanent ambassador to the galactic stage. Humanity had only been a spacefaring species for 74 years, and the rest of the galaxy never let them forget it. The infant species, they called humans behind closed doors, and sometimes not even behind closed doors, sometimes right to their faces, with the kind of polite cruelty that only truly ancient civilizations could manage. Ilara's aide, a young man named David Osei, walked beside her as they moved through the curved corridors of the station toward the council chamber. And he leaned close to whisper, "Ambassador, I have read every briefing file 3 times, and I still don't fully understand how this place works." "It works the way every broken system works," Ilara said without turning her head. "It survives by pretending it is not broken." The council chamber was enormous, a vast circular arena with tiered seating that rose in spirals toward a ceiling made of transparent crystal, through which the dying red star cast everything in a faint crimson glow. And Ilara thought it looked less like a place of governance and more like an operating theater, the kind where you watch surgeries from above. Each species had its own section, its own delegation, its own traditions for how they sat and spoke and voted. And humanity's section was the smallest, tucked into a far corner like an afterthought. 6 seats where another species had 60. The session began, and the council speaker, an ancient being from the Ol Collective who resembled a massive floating jellyfish wrapped in bioluminescent silk, called the assembly to order in a voice that resonated through the chamber like a deep bell underwater. "The council recognizes the matter before us today," the speaker announced. "The Dralkith Dominion's recent military action in the Villani systems, and the formal request by the Villani people for council intervention." Ilara watched as a small delegation of Villani rose from their seats across the chamber, avian beings with delicate hollow bones and feathers that shimmered between silver and pale blue. And even from this distance, she could see that they were trembling. The Villani ambassador was old, his feathers dull and brittle, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the body and settles somewhere deep in the spirit. "3 of our colony worlds have been destroyed," he said, and the translation system carried his words to every ear in the chamber. "The Dralkith burned them from orbit. They did not invade, they did not occupy, they simply killed, and 1.2 billion of our people are gone. And we beg the council for justice." Justice. The word echoed through the chamber, and Ilara watched the faces of the other delegates as it did. Nobody flinched. Nobody reacted at all. Ilara Marin began to understand what this place truly was. The council speaker acknowledged the Villani's request, and then, with the same calm tone one might use to discuss trade tariffs, opened the floor for negotiation proceedings with the Dralkith Dominion. The Dralkith delegation sat in the largest section of the chamber, because of course they did. Massive reptilian beings with scaled hides the color of burnt iron, each one standing nearly 3 meters tall, with jaws that could crush bone and eyes that held the flat, patient cruelty of apex predators who had never once, in their evolutionary history, needed to feel afraid. Their high commander, Vorak Sethis, rose to his full height and looked out across the chamber with the lazy confidence of someone who already knew how this would end. The Dralkith Dominion exercised its sovereign right to secure its territorial interests, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. The Villani encroached upon resources that were rightfully ours, and we responded as any strong nation would. We are, however, willing to discuss terms for a cessation of further action. Terms, Elara thought. They killed over 1 billion people, and they were offering terms. She looked around the chamber again, searching for outrage, for fury, for even the smallest flicker of moral disgust, and she found nothing. Nothing except the smooth, practiced faces of diplomats who had done this 100 times before and would do it 100 times again. The council began to negotiate. Over the next 3 hours, Elara sat in stunned silence as she watched the most powerful governing body in the galaxy carefully, methodically, and with great diplomatic skill work out a deal that would reward the Dralkith for committing genocide. The proposed terms were simple. The Villani would surrender 2 of their remaining star systems to the Dominion, grant exclusive mineral rights to Dralkith mining corporations, and formally apologize for provoking the conflict. And in exchange, the Dralkith would agree to stop killing them. For now. David leaned over to Elara, his face pale. Ambassador, this cannot be how it actually works. It is, she said quietly. But they murdered over 1 billion. I know. And the council is just going to... I know, David. She sat back in her chair and folded her hands, and her expression revealed nothing. But anyone who had known Elara Marin for long enough would have recognized that stillness, because it was the same stillness she carried into hostage negotiations back on Earth. The stillness that came right before she made a decision that would change everything. As the session ended and the delegates began to file out, the old Villani ambassador crossed the chamber floor, moving slowly on legs that seemed barely able to carry him, and he stopped in front of the human section and looked directly at Elara, with eyes that were dark and hollow and filled with something that was not quite hope, but was perhaps the memory of what hope used to feel like. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, the way someone drowning looks at the shore. And Elara Marin looked back at him, and in her chest something that had been quiet for a very long time began to burn. She gave him one small nod. Then she returned to her quarters, sat down at her desk, and began to write a very long, very detailed report to Earth, one that would change the course of human history. The subject line read, "They reward the killers here." 3 weeks passed, and Elara Marin spent every single one of them watching and listening and saying almost nothing at all. She attended every council session. She read every record she could access. She studied 6,000 years of galactic history through the public archives. And every day the fire in her chest burned a little brighter and a little hotter, because the more she learned, the worse it got. The Dralkith had not committed genocide once. They had committed it 14 times across 2,000 years, targeting 9 different species, and every single time the Council had responded the exact same way. Negotiations, concessions, appeasement, and a polite request for the Dominion to please stop killing people. And every single time, the Dralkith had taken what was offered, waited a few decades, and done it again. But they were not the only ones. The Dralkith were simply the most brazen, the most obvious, the most willing to show their teeth in public. And behind them were a dozen other predator species who operated with more subtlety, but the same essential cruelty. Take what you want, hurt whoever stands in your way, and let the Council clean it up afterward by punishing the victims. The system was not broken, Elara realized. It was working exactly as designed. because it had been built by the powerful to protect the powerful, and the word peace was just the name they gave to the cage they kept everyone else inside. On the 22nd day, the final terms of the Dralkith-Violani agreement were presented to the full council for a vote. The terms were even worse than the original proposal. The Violani would now surrender 3 star systems instead of 2, grant mineral rights across their entire remaining territory, reduce their defensive fleet by 40%, and issue a formal public statement accepting shared responsibility for the conflict that had killed their people, responsibility for being murdered. The vote was called, and the speaker's voice rang through the chamber as each species registered its position. 109 species voted in favor, 22 species abstained, and 1 species, exactly 1, voted against. Earth votes no, Alara said, and her voice was calm and clear and carried through the entire chamber like a blade cutting silk. The silence that followed lasted only a moment, but it was heavy. The kind of heavy that comes when someone does something that has simply never been done before. Because in 6,000 years, no species had ever cast a lone dissenting vote against an appeasement resolution. The speaker rotated its massive translucent body toward the human section with what might have been curiosity or might have been irritation. It was hard to tell with a species that had no face. The Council acknowledges Earth's dissent, the speaker said. However, as the youngest member species, Earth is reminded that galactic diplomacy requires a perspective broader than the emotional reactions of a civilization, still learning the complexities of interstellar relations. Ilara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Not yet. The resolution passes, the speaker continued. The Villani will comply with the agreed terms within 1 standard cycle. Across the chamber, the old Villani ambassador closed his eyes, and his feathers, those beautiful silver-blue feathers, seemed to lose their last trace of shimmer, as if something inside him had finally gone dark. The Dralkith delegation did not celebrate openly, because they did not need to. Vorak Sethis simply leaned back in his massive seat and let the corners of his mouth pull into something that was not quite a smile, but was far worse. The quiet satisfaction of a predator who knows the hunt is already over. After the vote, Ilara requested a formal right to address the council, privilege that any member species could invoke once per session cycle, and the speaker, perhaps out of amusement more than respect, granted her 3 minutes. She stood, and even though she was small compared to most of the beings in that chamber, a single human woman, standing barely 5.5 feet tall in a room full of giants, something about the way she held herself made every eye turn toward her. "I will not argue against the vote," she began. "It is done, and I respect the Council's process, even when I believe the Council's process is deeply and fundamentally wrong." A murmur rippled through the chamber. "Instead, I would like to share something with this body, not an opinion, but data." She activated her personal display, and a holographic projection appeared above the council floor, showing a timeline that stretched back 2,000 years. In the year 4026 by the Galactic Standard Calendar, the Dralkith Dominion destroyed the Kalori. Homeworld, 80 million dead, and the Council negotiated a settlement that granted the Dominion control of the Kalori's asteroid mining networks. She advanced the timeline. In 4189, the Dominion bombarded the Sethari colonies. 300 million dead, and the Council negotiated a settlement that granted territorial concessions and trade advantages. She advanced it again, and again, and again. 14 incidents, 14 acts of mass killing, 14 negotiations, 14 rewards. Every single time this body chose to negotiate with the Dralkith after an act of mass violence, the Dominion received something it wanted. And every single time within decades, it committed the same violence again against a different target. She paused and looked around the chamber. "I am not presenting this to shame anyone. I am presenting it because I want this council to see what I see, which is a pattern so obvious that the only reason it has not been recognized is that we have been too afraid to name it." Addressed is because addressing it would require courage, and courage has not been asked of anyone in this chamber for a very long time. The silence was absolute, not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the brittle silence of a room full of people who have just been told something they already knew, but had spent centuries pretending they did not. Vorak Sethis rose from his seat, his massive frame casting a shadow that fell across half the chamber floor, and his voice was a low growl that carried the unmistakable edge of a threat. "The human ambassador should be careful," he said. "Earth is a small world with a small fleet, and the galaxy is a dangerous place for small species that do not know when to be quiet." Every delegate in the chamber understood what he was saying. It was not a warning, it was a promise. The same kind of promise the Drelkith had made to the Violani and the Kalori and the Sethari before them. Ilara looked directly at the massive, reptilian commander, and she did not step back, and she did not look away, and she did not lower her voice. "Noted," she said. And then she sat down. The session ended, and the delegates filed out in clusters of whispered conversation, and Ilara could feel the weight of 100 different alien gazes on her back. Some confused, some angry, some afraid, and a few, just a very few, carrying something that looked almost like admiration. David was waiting for her outside the chamber, and his face was tight with anxiety. "Ambassador, the Drelkith just threatened us in front of the entire council. This is going to escalate, and we do not have the military strength to—" "David," she said quietly, and he stopped. "I need you to open a secure channel to Earth Command. Priority black, quantum encrypted, no relay stations." His eyes widened. "Ambassador, that classification is reserved for—" "I know what it is reserved for." He stared at her for a long moment, and then he nodded and walked quickly toward the communication suite. 20 minutes later, Ilara sat alone in a sealed room and transmitted a single coded message to the United Planetary Command on Earth. "Contingency Iron Veil, authorization requested." The response came back in 47 minutes, faster than any message had ever been returned from Earth Command in the short history of humanity's galactic presence. "Authorized." Ilara read the word, closed the channel, and sat in the dark for a long time. Later that evening, as she walked through the station's lower corridors, she found the old Violani ambassador standing alone near an observation window, staring out at the dying red star, with his thin arms folded across his chest, and his dull feathers hanging limp around his shoulders. Footsteps, and his dark, hollow eyes found hers. "Why did you vote against?" he asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "No one has ever voted against. Not once, not for anyone, not for us, not for any of the others who came before us. So why would you?" Ilara stood beside him and looked out at the star, and when she spoke, her voice was low and steady, and carried the weight of something very old and very human. "Because where I come from, you do not make deals with people who murder children." The Violani ambassador said nothing, but a single tear, clear as glass, rolled down the side of his narrow face, and fell silently to the floor. And somewhere far away, on a small blue world, orbiting an ordinary yellow star, the wheels of something very large and very powerful had already begun to turn. 1 month after the vote, the Dralkith Dominion proved Ilara Marin right in the worst possible way. They called it a disciplinary border action, a phrase so clean and diplomatic that it almost hid the blood underneath, and they targeted a frontier system at the very edge of human-administered space. A small cluster of 3 habitable moons, where a joint human-Volani refugee colony had been established just 2 years earlier. The colony was called New Haven, and it was home to 42,000 Volani refugees who had fled the destruction of their worlds, along with 6,000 human aid workers, engineers, teachers, and their families who had volunteered to help build something new in the ashes of something terrible. The Dralkith fleet arrived without warning, 12 warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a tight formation above the largest moon. And they did not issue demands. They did not broadcast threats. They did not negotiate, or posture, or give anyone the chance to surrender. They simply opened fire. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. When it was over, New Haven was a graveyard. 14,000 Villani dead, 832 humans dead, entire settlements reduced to craters of molten glass and ash. And among the dead were 114 human children who had been attending a school that morning. A school that had been built with volunteer labor and painted bright yellow because someone had thought the Villani kids and the human kids would like learning in a building that looked like sunshine. The news reached Valeth Prime before the fires on New Haven had even stopped burning, and the Galactic Council convened an emergency session within hours. The fastest response in decades, though whether that speed was motivated by genuine alarm or by the political complexity of a major species losing civilians, nobody could say for certain. The chamber was full, every seat occupied, every delegation present, and the tension was different this time. Thicker, heavier, carrying the sharp electric edge of something that might actually be dangerous. The council speaker opened the session with its usual measured calm, calling for structured dialogue regarding the recent incident in the frontier territories, and urging all parties to approach the matter with the wisdom and restraint that has preserved galactic peace for 6 millennia. The Drelkith delegation showed no remorse whatsoever. Vorak Sethis stood before the council and declared that the colony had been established in a disputed zone, and that the Dominion had merely enforced its territorial claim through appropriate measures. And he expressed what he called regret for any collateral impact, while making it absolutely clear that the Dominion considered the matter closed. Then the speaker invited the affected parties to respond, and every eye in the chamber turned to the small human section in the corner. Ilara Marin stood, and the chamber fell silent in a way it had not fallen silent for anyone in a very long time. She was wearing a simple dark uniform, no decorations, no insignia of rank, nothing but plain black fabric. And her face was calm, in the way that deep water is calm, still on the surface, but carrying enormous force underneath. She did not speak immediately. She stood there and let the silence build, let it press against the walls of the chamber, let it fill the space between every delegate and every seat, until it became almost unbearable. And then she began to speak, in a voice that was quiet and steady, and carried to every corner of the room without effort. For 6,000 years, this council has sat in these chairs and negotiated with killers. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, and ripples of movement passed through the delegations, a shifting of weight, a turning of heads, small involuntary reactions of beings who sense that something is about to change. You have watched species burn, she continued. You have watched worlds die, and you have watched children be buried under rubble and ash, and your answer, every single time, has been to ask the killers what they want. She paused, and her eyes moved across the chamber, touching every delegation, lingering nowhere, accusing everyone. You have called this peace. You have told yourselves that this is what civilization looks like, that compromise is wisdom, that negotiation is strength, that the ability to sit across a table from someone who has just murdered 1 billion innocent people and offer them a trade deal is somehow the highest achievement of intelligent life. Her voice did not rise, did not crack, did not waver. It remained level and clear, and that made it worse, because rage can be dismissed, but calm conviction cannot. It is not peace. It is cowardice with a title, and every species in this chamber knows it, and you have known it for centuries, and you have said nothing, because saying something would require you to risk something, and you have decided that the lives of the Villani, and the Kalori, and the Sathari, and all the others are not worth the risk. The Drelkith delegation began to stir, and Vorak Cephas opened his mouth to interrupt. But Alara did not give him the chance. 14 times, she said, and her voice cut through the chamber like a wire pulled tight. 14 times the Drelkith have slaughtered the innocent, and 14 times you rewarded them. And today they have killed our people, our engineers who came here to build, our teachers who came here to educate, our children who came here because their parents believed that the galaxy could be better than it is. She stopped, and for one long breath, there was no sound at all in the council chamber. No movement, no whisper, nothing but the faint hum. The station's life support systems, and the distant red light of the dying star filtering through the crystal ceiling. So let me be perfectly clear, Alara Marin said, on behalf of the entire human race. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and spoke 7 words that would be remembered for 10,000 years. We do not negotiate with killers. The chamber erupted, delegates shouting, translation systems struggling to keep up, the speaker's deep resonant voice calling for order. But Alara was not finished. She reached up to the side of her head, and with a deliberate motion that every being in the chamber could see, deactivated her translation implant, the device that allowed her to understand and be understood by every species in the room. It was the single most insulting gesture in galactic diplomacy, the equivalent of declaring that nothing anyone in this room had to say was worth hearing. Then she turned her back on the chamber. She walked down the steps from the human section, across the chamber floor, past rows of stunned and furious delegates, and she did not look at any of them, did not acknowledge the shouts or the demands for her to stop, did not slow her pace for even a moment. She walked straight out the main doors, and they closed behind her with a sound that echoed through the chamber like the final note of something that could never be played again. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then, Vorak Cephas began to laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that shook his massive chest and echoed off the ancient walls. The infant species throws a tantrum, he said, and his tone dripped with amusement. Let them go and sulk in their corner of the galaxy. They will come crawling back when they realize how small they truly are, and when they do, we will be here to remind them of their place. Several delegations laughed with him, nervously, but they laughed. Not be laughing for long. Within 6 hours of Alara's departure from the chamber, every human diplomat on Valith Prime boarded transport shuttles and left the station. Not just the diplomatic staff, but every human trader, scientist, engineer, and civilian on the entire orbital complex. Within 12 hours, the same thing was happening across the galaxy. On trading stations, on research outposts, on medical facilities, on infrastructure projects, on joint military installations. Every single human being in Council space was packing up and leaving. Within 48 hours, Earth went dark. All communication channels, diplomatic, commercial, scientific, military, went silent at once, as if someone had reached into the void and simply switched off an entire civilization. No warnings, no final messages, no dramatic declarations, just silence, complete and absolute, a silence so total that it was louder than anything the galaxy had ever heard. Galaxy had seen species go to war. It had seen empires rise and fall, and alliances shatter, and worlds burn. But it had never, not once in 9,000 years, seen a species simply walk away from the conversation entirely. And in that silence, for the first time in 6,000 years, the Galactic Council did not know what to do next. The galaxy learned what contingency Iron Veil was not through any announcement or declaration, but through the slow and mounting horror of watching an entire civilization seal itself behind a wall that nothing could penetrate. It began at the borders of human space, a sphere of territory encompassing Earth and 43 colony worlds scattered across a region that the galactic charts labeled as Sector 9 Gamma, a modest territory by the standards of older civilizations, but one that had become far more important than its size suggested. Within 72 hours of Earth going dark, automated defense platforms activated along every border of human space. Thousands of them, stations that nobody in the galaxy had even known existed, hidden inside asteroid fields, buried in the crusts of dead moons, drifting silently in the void between stars, and each one carrying enough firepower to slag a capital ship. Behind the defense platforms came the quantum disruption fields, a technology that humanity had apparently developed in secret and never shared with anyone. Massive energy barriers that scrambled faster than light navigation systems and made it impossible for any ship to enter human space without being torn apart at the subatomic level during transit. And behind the disruption fields came the AI-controlled kill zones, autonomous weapons networks with reaction times measured in nanoseconds, systems that could identify, track, and destroy any object larger than a fist that crossed into their operational range. Human space did not just close, it became a black void on the star map, a region of absolute silence from which no signal emerged, and into which no ship could travel, and the galaxy stared at it the way a person stares at a door that has just been locked from the other side. The first real wave of panic hit 3 weeks later, and it did not come from military concerns, it came from economics. In 74 years of galactic membership, humanity had woven itself into the fabric of interstellar civilization far more deeply than anyone had realized. Because humans had a peculiar talent that no other species had ever quite understood. They were extraordinarily good at making themselves useful. Human quantum processing technology, faster, more efficient, and more reliable than anything the galaxy had ever produced, had become the backbone of interstellar banking, and 60% of all galactic financial transactions ran through human-designed systems that were now dark and unreachable. Human biomedical research had produced treatments and pharmaceuticals that dozens of species depended on, including 3 species whose populations required human-developed gene therapies to survive a plague that had been raging for 40 years. Human engineers had been embedded in critical infrastructure projects across Council space, power grids, communication networks, atmospheric processors, orbital stabilization systems, and without them, things that had been running smoothly for decades began to fail in ways that nobody else knew how to fix. Markets crashed within the first month, not a gentle decline, but a violent collapse that wiped out trillions in value across every major trading hub in the galaxy. And species that had been wealthy and comfortable suddenly found themselves scrambling for resources that had always been abundant. Medical shortages followed. Hospitals on 14 worlds reported critical failures in pharmaceutical supply chains. And a species called the Morphine, whose entire population of 8 billion depended on a human-manufactured antiviral compound, sent desperate pleas to Earth that vanished into the silence like stones dropped into a bottomless well. The Galactic Council convened session after session, each one more frantic than the last, and the debates raged for weeks. Some delegates demanded military action to force open human borders. Others begged for diplomatic outreach. Others blamed the Draelkith for provoking this crisis. And through it all, the speaker called for calm and patience and the time-honored tradition of negotiation. They sent envoys to the edge of human space, diplomatic ships carrying representatives from 30 different species, broadcasting messages of reconciliation and requests for dialogue on every known frequency. The ships reached the border, and the automated defense drones intercepted them, gently, without violence, guiding them to a safe distance with escort formations that were precise and professional and completely emotionless. And then the drones broadcast a single looping message in every language known to the galaxy. We do not negotiate with killers. Change the terms. The envoys returned empty-handed, and the council descended into something that looked very much like despair. Because no censor could penetrate Iron Veil, and no spy could breach human borders, was what was happening on the other side of that wall of silence. Humanity was not hiding. Humanity was building. On Earth, the United Planetary Command had activated every industrial facility on the planet, converting civilian manufacturing to military production, with the kind of organized efficiency that was built into the human species at a genetic level. The same efficiency that had produced the arsenal of democracy in the 20th century. The same relentless productive fury that had rebuilt entire continents after devastating wars. On 43 colony worlds, the same transformation was underway. Shipyards that had been producing cargo transports were now producing warships. Laboratories that had been developing consumer technology were now developing weapon systems. Training academies that had been preparing the next generation of engineers and scientists were now preparing the next generation of soldiers. And all of it was pointed in a single direction. Not at the Dralekith, not at the Council, not at any threat to humanity itself, but at a purpose so strange and so unprecedented that it would have confused every strategic analyst in the galaxy if they had known about it. Humanity was preparing to fight a war on behalf of someone else. Not for territory, not for resources, not for political advantage, for the Villani, a species that most humans had never met, from worlds that most humans could not find on a map, whose only connection to Earth was that they had been hurt and nobody had helped them, and that was enough, because humanity carried in its collective memory the knowledge of what happens when good people do nothing while innocents are destroyed. The Dralekith, meanwhile, saw none of this. They saw only the chaos, the economic collapse, the Council's paralysis, and they saw opportunity. And the galaxy in disarray. Vorak Sethis launched the most ambitious military expansion in Dralekith history. 3 more Villani systems conquered in rapid succession, followed by invasions of 2 neutral species territories that had previously been under Council protection. And the Council could do nothing, because the doctrine of mutual preservation had always been an illusion held together by the unspoken agreement of every species to pretend it was real. And now that the pretense was gone, there was nothing left but the naked truth that the galaxy's peace had never been peace at all. The Villani were being pushed to the edge of extinction, their remaining worlds overcrowded with refugees, their fleet destroyed, their resources exhausted. Their pleas to the Council answered with sympathy and promises, and absolutely nothing of substance. And then, 6 months into the silence, something happened that nobody expected. A single transmission broke through Iron Veil. Not broadcast to the Council, not sent to any government or military frequency, but transmitted directly and specifically to every Villani receiver in the galaxy, cutting through jamming fields and encryption barriers, and reaching every ship, every station, every refugee camp, every hiding place where Villani survivors huddled in the dark, waiting for the end. The message was short, just 2 words, written in the Villani language, in a script that was ancient and sacred, and used only for promises that could never be broken. We are coming. Across the galaxy, in refugee camps and on dying worlds, and in the crowded holds of fleeing ships, Villani who had given up hope read those 2 words, and for the first time in months, their feathers began to shimmer again. And on the far side of Iron Veil, 300 human warships completed their final systems checks, powered up their engines, and pointed their bows toward the stars. Alara Marin stood on the bridge of the flagship, a massive vessel named the UPS Remember New Haven, and she looked out at the fleet arrayed around her, 300 ships, crewed by men and women, who had volunteered, knowing they might not come home. And she thought about the old Villani ambassador, with his dull feathers and his hollow eyes. And she thought about the children in the yellow school building. and she thought about every species that had ever been crushed under the boot of a predator, while the galaxy watched and did nothing. "Open the veil," she said. The galaxy saw the iron veil fall before it understood what was emerging from behind it. And by the time it understood, it was already too late for the Dralkith Dominion. 300 warships came through the gap, in a formation so tight and so precise that long-range sensors initially registered them as a single massive object, one enormous signature moving through space at speeds that should not have been possible for vessels of that size. And when the formation spread and the individual ships became visible, a cold and terrible silence fell across every monitoring station in the galaxy. The ships were not beautiful. They were not the gleaming, ornate vessels that the galaxy's great powers favored, with their sweeping curves and decorative hull patterns and elaborate displays of wealth and status. These ships were ugly and brutal and honest, covered in thick angular armor plating the color of storm clouds, bristling with weapon arrays that the galactic community's databases could not identify, and every line of their construction communicated a single message. These were not built to impress. These were built to end things. The fleet designation was broadcast on an open channel: United Planetary Strike Force, Task Force Liberation, and the destination was clear to everyone watching: the Villani Threshold, the contested region of space where the Dralkith occupation fleet held 3 conquered Villani star systems. Vorak Sethis received the report aboard his flagship, the Dominion's Pride, a massive dreadnought that was the largest warship in the galaxy. And when his intelligence officers told him that the human fleet numbered 300 vessels, he bared his teeth in what his species used instead of laughter. 300, he said. We have 712 ships in the occupation zone alone. The humans are brave, I will grant them that, but bravery without numbers is just a more interesting way to die. Ordered the full Dralkith war fleet to form up at the Villani threshold and prepare for engagement. And he broadcast a message to the human fleet: turn back now, and the Dominion will consider this a misunderstanding. Advance further, and you will learn why no species has ever challenged us and survived. The human fleet did not respond. It did not slow down. It did not change course. It simply kept coming, silent and steady and inevitable, like a tide that does not care about the rocks in its path. The Battle of the Villani Threshold began at 0347 Galactic Standard Time, when the first Dralkith long-range batteries opened fire on the approaching human formation, and it would last 11 hours, and it would be remembered as the most devastating military engagement in the recorded history of every civilization in the known galaxy. The Dralkith expected the battle to be a slaughter. They outnumbered the humans more than 2 to 1, larger and heavier. Their weapons were tested and proven across centuries of intimidation and conquest. And they had never lost a major engagement in their entire history as a spacefaring species. They were wrong about everything. The human ships fought with a level of coordination that the Dralkith had never encountered and could not comprehend. Every vessel was linked through an AI-assisted tactical network that processed battlefield data in real time and shared it across the entire fleet simultaneously, so that every ship knew what every other ship knew. Every captain saw what every other captain saw, and the fleet moved not as 300 individual vessels, but as a single organism with 300 fists. When the Dralkiths tried to overwhelm the human flanks with superior numbers, the human formation shifted like water flowing around a stone, absorbing the attack and reforming with their guns already tracking new targets. Their feared boarding torpedoes, massive projectiles designed to breach enemy hulls and deliver shock troops directly into the interior. Human point defense systems shredded them in flight with kinetic accelerator rounds that moved so fast they were invisible to the naked eye. And when the Drelkith brought their heaviest capital ships forward, expecting their reinforced shields to absorb whatever the humans could throw at them, the human fleet deployed weapons that no galactic database had ever catalogued. Directed energy lances that cut through Drelkith's shielding like sunlight through fog, swarm drone systems that latched onto hull surfaces and dismantled critical systems from the outside in, and electromagnetic pulse warheads that detonated inside shield perimeters and shut down entire ship formations at once, leaving them dark and drifting and helpless. But what truly shattered the Drelkith, what broke their will and their fleet and their understanding of what they were facing, was not the technology. It was the way the humans fought. Behind the human battle line, protected by a wall of warships that absorbed punishment without giving ground, a convoy of Violani evacuation transports was fleeing the occupied systems. Hundreds of civilian ships, packed with refugees, the last survivors of worlds that the Drelkith had conquered, moving as fast as their old engines could carry them towards safety. The Drelkith targeted those transports because that was what the Drelkith did. They struck at the weak, they punished the vulnerable, they used cruelty as strategy. And when a squadron of Drelkith destroyers broke through the battle line and made a run at the evacuation convoy, 3 human frigates moved to intercept. 3 frigates against 11 destroyers. The math was suicide, and everyone in the galaxy watching through long-range sensors knew it was suicide. And the crews of those 3 frigates knew it was suicide. They engaged anyway. They threw themselves into the path of the Drelkith squadron and fought with a ferocity that defied every tactical model the Dominion had ever built, absorbing fire that should have destroyed them twice over, refusing to break formation, refusing to retreat, holding the line with burning hulls and failing systems until reinforcements could arrive. And when it was over, all 3 frigates were destroyed, but the evacuation convoy was untouched, and 9 of the 11 Drelkith destroyers were debris. That was the moment Vorak Sethis understood that he was not fighting a species that wanted to win a battle. He was fighting a species that was willing to die for people who were not even their own kind. And he had no framework for understanding that. No tactical doctrine that accounted for an enemy that measured victory not in territory gained, but in lives protected. The battle raged for 11 hours, and by the end, the mathematics of the engagement had been rewritten in fire and blood and silence. 94 human ships were destroyed, 30,000 human soldiers dead, their names already being recorded in databases on Earth that would become memorials and monuments and sacred lists that future generations would read aloud on anniversaries. But the Drelkith fleet was annihilated. Over 600 ships destroyed or disabled, the rest scattered and fleeing, their proud formation broken into fragments that would never reassemble. And the Dominion's pride, Vorak Sethis's flagship, was boarded by human marines who cut through its corridors with methodical precision and took the High Commander alive, dragging him from his command chair in restraints, while he snarled and snapped his jaws at captors who did not flinch. The Galactic Council had watched the entire battle through long-range sensor arrays, and the chamber on Valith Prime was silent in a way it had never been silent before. Not the silence of diplomacy or decorum, but the silence of 131 species witnessing something that should have been impossible. They had just watched the youngest civilization in the galaxy destroy the most feared military power in known space. Not for conquest, not for revenge, not for resources, but for the right of a dying species to survive. 3 days after the battle, Elara Marin returned to the council chamber. She was not the same woman who had walked out of those doors 6 months earlier. She was thinner, harder, and her eyes carried the weight of 30,000 names that she would carry for the rest of her life. But her voice was steady, and when she stood before the full council, every seat in the gallery was occupied, and beings who had traveled weeks to witness this moment pressed against the walls and filled the corridors outside. "We did not do this for power," she said. "We did not do this for territory or resources or political advantage. We did this because 1.2 billion Villani are dead, and this council's answer was to give their killers a reward, and because 832 of our people, including 114 children, were murdered while the galaxy watched and did nothing." She paused, and her eyes swept the chamber one final time. "Humanity proposes a new doctrine to replace the doctrine of mutual preservation. We call it the doctrine of consequences, and it is simple. From this day forward, any species that commits acts of mass violence against civilians will not be negotiated with. They will be stopped, by force if necessary, and they will face judgment for what they have done." She straightened her shoulders. "Any species that wishes to stand with us may do so. Any species that does not, we understand. But know this, the age of rewarding killers is over." The vote was called, and for the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, the result was not unanimous. 87 species voted in favor, 31 abstained, and 14 voted against and left the council permanently, walking out through the same doors that Alara had walked out of 6 months ago. Though they walked with far less dignity. The Drelkith Dominion was formally dissolved, its territories placed under joint administration, its military permanently disbanded, its leadership arrested and transferred to a tribunal that would take 3 years to complete, and would result in the conviction of every senior Drelkith commander for crimes against sentient life. And Vorak Sethis was sentenced to permanent confinement in a facility where he would live out his remaining centuries surrounded by the recorded testimonies of every species his people had ever harmed. After the vote, in the corridor outside the chamber, the old Villani ambassador found Alara. His feathers had changed. They were no longer dull and brittle, but had begun to shimmer again, faintly, like the first light of a dawn that nobody believed would come. And there were tears on his face, clear as glass, falling freely down his narrow cheeks. "Why?" he asked, and his voice broke on the word. "You lost 30,000 of your people for us. You fought and bled and died for a species you had known for less than a year. Why would you do that?" Alara placed her hand on his shoulder, gently, the way you touch something precious and fragile and worth protecting, and she looked into his dark eyes and said the last words of the story that would be told for 10,000 years. "Because that is what humans do. We do not look away." And across the galaxy, on worlds that had once cowered in silence, on stations where the weak had learned to accept their suffering as the cost of survival, on frontier colonies where children grew up believing that nobody would ever come to help them, a phrase began to appear, carved into stone, and painted on walls, and whispered in the dark by people who had finally found the courage to believe that the universe could be better than it was. 7 words that had shattered a 6,000-year-old lie, and replaced it with something that the galaxy had almost forgotten was possible. 7 words that meant you are not alone, and you never will be again. We do not negotiate with killers.